How to Speak, How to Listen by Mortimer J.Adler continued.
Disc 7.
First Thursday, 4th session. Aristotle, Politics, Book 1, 4th century B.C. Rousseau, The Social Contract, Book 1, 18th century. Here we have the basic questions about the origin and nature of civil society, the political community, or the state and its government, including questions about how government is compatible with freedom, under what conditions government is legitimate, what is involved in the distinction between despotic government and constitutional government, and in the distinction between being the subject of a despot and the citizen of a republic. In the course of the discussion of these matters, another basic issue about equality emerges, namely, the issue whether, in fact, all men are equal. Aristotle holding that some men are, by nature, intended to be citizens and to exercise political freedom, while others are intended by nature to be slaves and to serve their masters. Rousseau holding the very opposite view, that all men are, by nature, intended for a life of freedom, and that it is nurture or circumstances, not nature, that makes some men appear to be slavish. I cannot pass over this without reporting that in every seminar I have moderated, some participants, often a goodly number, finally find themselves in agreement with Aristotle rather than with Rousseau. Make of that what you will. First Friday, 5th session. Plato, The Republic, Books 1 and 2, together with the Melian dialogue from Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War. And first Saturday, 6th session, Machiavelli, The Prince. I have bracketed these 2 days together, because together these readings lead us into a discussion of the two great questions about what justice is, and about justice and expediency. The first of these questions is the easier of the two. A single line in Plato helps us to answer it. The line in which it is suggested that justice consists in giving to each man what is his due, what he has a rightful claim to. If this is not the whole answer, or if it involves further questions about what is due a man, or what he has a rightful claim to, it is at least the beginning of an answer about what justice is. The second question always leaves everyone puzzled, because Plato poses it so forcefully, and then does not provide even a clue to the answer in the texts that we read. The question is, why should I be just? What's in it for me? Will being just to others contribute to my own individual happiness? In short, is it expedient to be just? The problem having thus been posed by Plato, we find ourselves increasingly puzzled by Machiavelli's recommendations to the prince about the expediency or inexpediency of being a virtuous ruler. Would it be expedient to be a just ruler if all or most men are bad? And are most men in fact bad, or are they for the most part bad? If so, what is the expedient thing to do in dealing with them? If not, is justice, after all, also expedient? Second Monday, 7th session. Sophocles, Antigone, 5th century B.C. Melville, Billy Budd, 19th century. Martin Luther King, Letter from a Birmingham Jail, 20th century. I cannot possibly summarize the wonderfully intricate discussion of tragedy that these readings provoke and promote. There is time to make only one point here, namely, that when we understand the essence of tragedy as consisting in having to make an inescapable choice between equally evil alternatives, Martin Luther King's Letter from a Birmingham Jail opens our eyes to the tragic choice that confronts America today in the conflict between justice and expediency in the treatment of its black citizens. These 4 days, over which I have jumped at high speed, all contribute to our understanding of the problems of democracy and capitalism in the 20th century in ways that I have not had time to point out. Without further ado, I now turn to the remaining 5 days, in which we deal with questions about liberty in relation to law and government, and with basic problems concerning the production and distribution of wealth and the ownership of property. The questions about liberty occur on the second Tuesday. Second Tuesday, 8th session. John Locke, Second Treatise on Civil Government, 1689. Jonathan Boucher, on Civil Liberty, 1775. John Stuart Mill, on Liberty, 1863. The two questions that control our discussion of these three texts are, first, whether there is one or several conceptions of liberty presented in the pages that we have read, and second, if there are several, how they differ in their understanding of the relation of liberty to law and government. The exploration of these questions reflects backward upon the problems we have been facing concerning the relation of liberty and equality, as well as the distinctions we have been considering concerning the kinds of government. The quickest way, perhaps, to summarize what can be learned from the reading and discussion of these materials is to catch what is central and pivotal in the views of each of the three authors. Jonathan Boucher first, a Tory preacher in the American colonies, trying to persuade his congregation not to rebel against their king and parliament. His view of government is that the king rules by divine right as vicar of God on earth. He has read John Locke's second treatise, and will have no truck with all this talk about freedom under government being derived from the consent of the governed, or about unalienable natural rights, including the right to dissent, or even to rebel. Freedom, for Boucher, consists not in doing as one pleases, but only in doing as one ought. And since the law of God or the law of the king, lays down what one ought or ought not to do, freedom consists in acting in accordance with the law. The spheres of law and of liberty, of conduct regulated by law and of conduct that manifests freedom, coincide perfectly. All else is license. That is, doing as one pleases is not liberty, but license. Boucher stands out at one extreme, and by consulting our texts, we soon find that J.S. Mill, the great exponent of liberalism in the 19th century, stands at the opposite pole. Freedom, according to Mill, consists in doing what one pleases, provided that in doing so we do no injury to others or to the community. Since the law aims to prescribe conduct that is injurious, harmful to the community or to its members, the individual who behaves lawfully, who obeys the law, is, in doing so, not free. Neither is the criminal who disobeys the law. Criminal behavior is license, not liberty. Where Boucher made the spheres of law and liberty perfectly coincident, Mill makes them absolutely exclusive. This strikes us most forcefully when we find the passage in which he says that as the sphere of law enlarges, the sphere of liberty diminishes, and conversely. The more things are regulated by law and government, the less free we are, and so, as one who wishes to maximize human freedom, Mill calls for as little government as possible, no more than is needed to do for society what its individuals or its private associations cannot do for themselves. In our discussion of Mill, we cannot avoid noting how much a 19th century liberal sounds like a 20th century Goldwater conservative. Our discussion, having located the polar extremes, now tries to find the middle ground between them. It is occupied by John Locke. His position becomes clear as we observe that, for him, freedom takes three distinct forms. First, there is political liberty, the liberty of the citizen who is governed only with his consent, and who also, through the exercise of suffrage, has a voice in his own government. This we recall, is the liberty that Aristotle first conceived when he spoke of constitutional government as the government of free men and equals, each a citizen having a share of the sovereignty and a voice in his own government. Second, there is liberty under law. According to Locke, a man is free when he obeys a law established by a government to which he has given his consent, and in the making of which law he has exercised a voice through suffrage. We note how different this conception of liberty under law is from Boucher's conception of it. The subject of an absolute monarch, obeying his edicts, would be acting as a free man, according to Boucher, but not according to Locke. Only the consenting citizen with suffrage is free when he acts in obedience to law. Third, there is the freedom to do as one pleases in all matters about which the law is silent, or, as Locke says, in all matters where the law prescribes not. With all these distinctions on the table, the discussion pulls some things together that have been up in the air for several days. Someone always asks how it can be said that a man is free when he obeys a law that is contrary to his wishes. He has opposed the making of that law, but it has been made a law by the majority, and he belongs to the adversely affected minority. How is such a man free? If he is not free, someone else always observes, then majority rule, under a constitutional government, involves a deprivation of freedom for minorities, as much of a deprivation of freedom as is suffered by the subjects of an absolute monarch. The difference then begins to become clear. The subject of an absolute monarch is ruled without his consent and without participation through suffrage. But the citizen of a republic has given his consent to the Constitution, or the framework of government, and also to the principle of decision by majorities. He has, therefore, agreed in advance to the legitimacy of a law that is both constitutional and also has the support of the majority. In that case, such a law is a law of his own making, even though he may have voted against it or wished it not to become law. The adversely affected minority is, therefore, as free under the law as the majority who enacted it. This does not mean, of course, that a majority cannot misrule, and that one or another minority cannot be oppressed by such misrule. But we also come to discover that the only remedy for majority misrule is the American invention of a judicial review of legislation. In the case of despotic misrule, the only remedy is rebellion. At the conclusion of our conversation about these matters, I cannot refrain from calling attention to an insight that has emerged from such discussions in many years of Aspen seminars. Our century has witnessed a revolutionary change that is like a continental divide or watershed in history. In all preceding centuries, social, political, or economic injustice always took the form of the exploitation of the many by the few, misrule by a minority, oppression of the majority. In our century, for the first time, the situation is radically reversed in all our constitutional democracies. Now, such injustice as exists takes the form of misrule by the majority and the oppression of one or another minority. The portent, or prospect for the future that we see here, is the elimination of conflict between the opposed interests of majorities and minorities, with the achievement of a society that is more truly classless than any that now exists, a society from which all class conflict has been removed. One other pointer to be learned from this is that rebellion against misrule is more difficult to mount and has less chance of success when the impulse to rebel motivates a minority instead of a majority. Second Wednesday, 9th session. On this occasion, we return to three authors that we have already read, to Aristotle's Politics, Rousseau's Social Contract, and Locke's second treatise of civil government. But now, the selections that we read are not about the state and government, or about liberty and equality, but about an idea that we had not yet explored to any extent, the idea of property, and with it all the questions concerning the right to ownership, the production and distribution of wealth, and, once again, the ideas of economic justice and economic equality. The text that lays the groundwork for our discussion is Chapter 5 of Locke's treatise, the chapter on property. We will find that the basic points of his analysis are confirmed in Chapter 9 of Book 1 of Rousseau's Social Contract. Some additional insights will be derived from our consideration of what Aristotle has to say about the acquisition and pursuit of wealth in the closing chapters of the first book of his Politics. What are Locke's basic points? They are, first, that every man has a natural right to property in his own person. He owns his own body and mind, and all their powers. They belong to him by birthright. The ownership by one man of another as a chattel slave is a violation of this natural right. Second, the opposite of natural property is that which is originally common to all men, the earth and all its resources. We then come, third, to Locke's great formulation of the labor theory of property. When an individual mixes his own labor power, of mind or body, with that which is common, the product of that mixture is rightfully his. Or, in other words, a man has a right to that which he produces by the application of his labor power to that which is common. The product is rightfully acquired property. The members of the group immediately call attention to two limitations that Locke then places on the acquisition of property. One is that the producer must not appropriate more than he can consume or more than he needs. He must not acquire a surplus that is wasted or unused. The other limitation is that he must not appropriate so much from the common that not enough is left for others to acquire by their labor for their needs. So far, so good. The points just made seem sound and unobjectionable. But as we explore the text further, and more carefully, we come upon two serious difficulties that leave us quite up in the air, and open the door to discussions that must take place in the days to follow. The first difficulty is fully understood only after we grapple with the following passage. He that is nourished by the acorns he picked up under an oak, or the apples he gathered from the trees in the wood, has certainly appropriated them to himself. And it is plain, if the first gathering made them not his, nothing else could. That labor put a distinction between them and common. That added something to them more than nature, the common mother of all, had done, and so they became his private right. Thus, the grass my horse has bit, the turfs my servant has cut, and the ore I have digged in any place, where I have a right to them in common with others, become my property without the assignment or consent of anybody. The labor that was mine, removing them out of that common state they were in, hath fixed my property in them. The ore that I have digged is mine by my own labor power. But what about the grass my horse has bit, or the turf my servant has cut? Here, we soon realize, is the first appearance of capital and labor as related factors in the production of wealth. My servant is a hired hand, a wage laborer. My horse, which I may own through having captured him and tamed him, is capital that I have rightfully acquired. Suppose, now, that I do no work myself, but put to work my horse, my capital, and my servant, a laborer whose wages I have paid. Can I rightfully claim possession of the product of these two factors, one of which I own, the horse, and the other of which I have paid off, the laborer? The import of that question becomes clear enough for us to realize that we had better table it for discussion later, when we have read the labor papers scheduled for Thursday and the Communist Manifesto scheduled for Friday. The second difficulty hits us when we find Locke saying that his own sensible limitations on the acquisition of wealth are set aside by the invention of money in the form of relatively imperishable pieces of metal. Since coin satisfies no natural need, as food, shelter, and clothing do, it is not subject to the injunction that a man should restrain himself from acquiring more than he needs. And since it is relatively imperishable, as consumable commodities are not, it does not spoil or waste. Locke offers no solution of this difficulty. He apparently sees no way to impose restraint on the accumulation of wealth in the form of money or coin. At this very point, however, Aristotle has something to say on this very same problem about the limited or limitless acquisition of wealth. We observe his distinction between natural and artificial wealth. Natural wealth in the form of consumable commodities, artificial wealth in the form of money, which should serve only as a medium of exchange. In the light of this distinction, Aristotle the moralist keeps reminding us that our aim is not just to live, but to live well, and so we should not accumulate wealth endlessly, but only as much as we need in order to lead a good life. The discussion at this point opens up questions about virtue and happiness, individual wants and natural needs, ethical questions, the importance of which we recognize, but which we cannot pursue at length. Yet they will hover around us in the subsequent sessions as we deal with the more strictly economic questions that the readings of the next few days raise for us. Second Thursday, 10th session. Alexander Hamilton, Report on Manufacturers, 1790. Boston Carpenters' Strike, 1825. Preamble of the Mechanics' Union of Philadelphia, 1827. On this occasion, the focus of our discussion is the incredibly remarkable document known as the Preamble of the Mechanics' Union, published in Philadelphia by American workmen some 20 years before Marx and Engels published the Communist Manifesto. Before I report the things that we learn from reading and discussing it, I must call attention to a few things that we come to see in the light of the other documents assigned for this session. Hamilton's arguments in favor of the greater productivity of an industrial or manufacturing economy, as compared with a non-industrial agricultural economy, cause us to consider the factors that can make one economy more productive than another. Let us consider two economies in which the only factors in the production of wealth are laborers and hand tools. The economy with more hands and hand tools will be the more productive. Now let us consider two economies, each of which has an equal supply of hands or manpower, but one of which has, in addition, productive machinery, driven by power other than human or animal power. In this case, Hamilton argues, the economy in which production involves machinery will clearly be the more productive, because the addition of machines can be equated to an increase in labor power or the number of hands. We find it useful at this point to introduce the terms laboristic and capitalistic as terms descriptive of the way in which wealth is produced, without any regard to how the instruments of its production are owned. An economy is laboristic in its mode of production if its wealth is produced mainly by human labor, aided only by hand tools and domesticated animals. An economy is capitalistic in its mode of production if its wealth is produced by the combination of human labor with power-driven machinery and other capital instruments of production. With this distinction before us, we see that Hamilton was saying that in a capitalistic economy, more wealth can be produced with less labor power, and that as capital instruments become more and more powerful productive forces, the same amount of wealth can be produced with fewer and fewer hands. The document that records the Boston Carpenters' Strike of 1825 presents statements by three parties: the journeymen, carpenters who are wage laborers; the master carpenters, whom today we would call the managers; and the gentlemen engaged in building, clearly the capitalists or owners of the means of production. The demands of labor, in this very early instance of a labor strike, are for higher wages and for shorter hours, and the purpose of the latter demand is not only to acquire more free time for themselves, but also to increase the opportunity for the employment of others who at the moment are out of work. The managers and the capitalists respond to these demands by saying that higher wages are out of the question. As for shorter hours, that is not good for the workmen because it will lead them into idleness and vice. It never occurs to them that they themselves have plenty of free time on their hands, and that if the workmen had been given schooling, they too could use the free time for the pursuits of leisure and not be corrupted by idleness or vice. When, a few years later, the Philadelphia mechanics made similar demands for higher wages and shorter hours, they specifically make this point, that they want more free time in order to engage in the pursuits of leisure that are so essential to the leading of a good human life. But that is not what we find most striking and most troubling in the preamble, which, by the way, echoes the high rhetorical tone of the Declaration of Independence. It is a very rich and subtle text to read and study, and by working at it, we discover points that anticipate the Communist Manifesto by 20 years. The most obvious of these is the argument that unless the capitalists, who are few, increase the purchasing power of the laborers, who are many, the increased productivity of an industrial economy will result in overproduction and underconsumption, with consequent economic crises for the capitalists as well as the workers. All questions of justice aside, the Philadelphia mechanics point out to the capitalists that raising wages is to their self-interest as a matter of expediency, for the increased purchasing power of labor will enable workmen to buy more of the goods, luxuries as well as necessities, that the capitalists want to sell. This is quickly seen as an anticipation of Henry Ford's reason for raising the wages of the workmen in his Detroit plant, and, in a way, it is also an anticipation of Marx's prediction that if the capitalists continue in their policy of paying bare subsistence wages, bourgeois capitalism will sow the seeds of its own destruction, for the successive cycles of boom and bust will end in one grand bust, or collapse of the whole system through overproduction and underconsumption. With some effort at a very close reading of the text, we next uncover in the arguments advanced two contradictions that set the stage for our discussion of the Communist Manifesto. The first is as follows. On the one hand, the mechanics claim that labor is the sole source of wealth, the only factor at work in its production, and that the capitalists, the owners of the means of production, contribute nothing at all. On the other hand, instead of asking for the whole pie, all the wealth produced, they ask only for their fair share. If, in fact, capitalists are unproductive, and labor is the only productive factor, then no return should go to capital and all should go to labor. The second contradiction is as follows. Though, as we have seen, the mechanics claim that labor is the sole source of wealth, the only productive factor, we find them conceding in one passage after another that the increased productivity of the society in which they live is to be attributed to the increased power of the machines that have resulted from modern science and technology. In fact, they point out that these powerful machines have steadily diminished the demand for labor. That certainly is inconsistent with their claim that labor is the only productive force, the sole factor operative in the production of wealth. I said, a moment ago, that these two contradictions set the stage for our discussion of Marx, for they bear directly on the central issue concerning the labor theory of value and the role of the capitalist in the production of wealth. But before we go forward to the consideration of that issue, let us look backward briefly at the bearing of these contradictions on what we learned from our discussion of Locke's labor theory of property, not the same as Marx's labor theory of value. Let us reconsider the man who, by his own labor, fenced in some land, and then, again by his own labor, caught a wild horse and tamed and trained him. Another man comes by his plot of land and freely contracts to work for him for a certain compensation. Does the man who rightfully owns the land and the horse, and pays another to work for him on his land and with his horse, contribute to production even though he does no further work himself? According to the labor theory of value, which holds that labor is the only factor in the production of wealth, the non-working capitalist, owner of the horse and land and employer or exploiter of labor, is non-productive, and so should receive no return whatsoever. But if the opposite theory is true, maintaining that there are two distinct factors in production, labor and capital, then the owner of capital contributes to production when he puts his capital to work even though he does no work himself, and so he should receive a share of the wealth produced, proportionate to the contribution made by his investment of capital. There is, of course, much more to say about all this, but it must wait for the final Friday and Saturday to which we now turn. Second Friday. 11th Session. Marx and Engels, The Communist Manifesto, 1848. Horace Mann, The Importance of Universal, Free, Public Education, 1854. Charles H. Vail, The Socialist Movement, 1903. We find that Marx and Engels are more rigorous in their statement of the labor theory of value than the Philadelphia mechanics, and that they do not hesitate to draw the only conclusion that can be drawn from that premise, instead of contradicting themselves. All wealth is produced by labor. The capital instruments used by laborers are themselves nothing but congealed labor. The owner of the capital instruments who does not work himself is totally unproductive and, making no contribution, should receive no part of the wealth produced. Any profit that he takes from the use of his capital is unearned increment and represents an exploitation of labor that is simply thievery. That, we are able to discover by a close reading of a few pages, is the argument in a nutshell. And in a few paragraphs more, we find that for all the wealth produced by labor to be enjoyed only by labor, it is necessary to abolish the private ownership of capital and to turn its ownership over to the community itself, the collective body known as the state. And the state will then become the sole distributor of the wealth produced, taking, as the slogan goes, from each according to his abilities, and giving to each according to his needs. There is still a step in the argument that is not sufficiently clear. We keep asking what it means to say that the capital instruments are congealed labor, and that, therefore, they should not be privately owned. The little essay by Charles Vail, an early American socialist, helps us to get a little better understanding of this point. Vail points out that when hand tools were privately produced by the individual workman and privately operated by him in his individual efforts, it was quite proper for such tools to be privately owned, and the fruit of their productivity to be privately acquired. But, Vail goes on, modern industrial capital is socially produced and socially operated. It is socially produced in the sense that the science and technology from which it originates is the product of human society as a whole over the centuries. It is socially operated in the sense that it requires an organized labor force to put it to work. Therefore, Vail argues, being socially produced and socially operated, it should be socially owned by the collectivity or the state, and the wealth it produces should be socially distributed by the state. At this point, objections begin to arise from many directions. I will only mention some of the most telling. Is capital socially produced? Are not the science and technology that go into the invention of industrial capital knowledge that exists in the public domain? Is it not like Locke's common, open to appropriation by anyone who has enough enterprise and ingenuity to make productive use of it? If so, then that argument against the private ownership of capital fails. If the capital has been fairly acquired by the enterprise of the capitalists, and if the capitalist then pays laborers the wages they demand as fair compensation for their labor, the production of wealth would seem to involve more than the one factor of labor, in the form of living or congealed labor. It would seem to involve a quite distinct productive factor: capital instruments in the form of natural resources and industrial machinery. The private owner of capital would then appear to be a producer, even if he does not work himself, and as a producer he would be entitled to his share of the wealth produced. With these questions and objections raised, the discussion returns to the text of the Communist Manifesto to take note of an inconsistency that opens a new line of thought for us. On the one hand, Marx alleges that it is the private ownership of the means of production that causes the exploitation of labor and the misery of the proletariat. That being the cause, the remedy is clear: abolish the private ownership of capital. The famous statement of this matter reads as follows: "The distinguishing feature of communism is not the abolition of property generally, but the abolition of bourgeois property. But modern bourgeois private property is the final and most complete expression of the system of producing and appropriating products that is based on class antagonisms, on the exploitation of the many by the few. In this sense, the theory of the communists may be summed up in the single sentence, abolition of private property." But just one page later, we come upon another statement that we always read aloud in the seminar, and that I will now read to you. "You are horrified at our intending to do away with private property. But in your existing society, private property is already done away with for 9/10 of the population. Its existence for the few is solely due to its non-existence in the hands of those 9/10. You reproach us, therefore, with intending to do away with a form of property, the necessary condition for whose existence is the non-existence of any property for the immense majority of society. In a word, you reproach us with intending to do away with your property." Precisely so. That is just what we intend. Did you hear what that said? And do you understand what it implies? It said that less than 1/10 of the population owns the means of production. For the other 9/10 or more, private property and the means of production has already been done away with by the vast accumulations acquired by a relatively few capitalists. A moment's thought will discover what is implied, namely, that the cause of economic injustice or inequity is not the private ownership of capital, but rather the concentration of such private ownership in the hands of a few. But if that is the case, rather than private ownership itself, then the remedy is not the abolition of private ownership, but rather overcoming its concentration by diffusing the ownership of capital. The Marxist remedy is exactly the opposite. The ownership of all means of production by the state is even more concentrated than its ownership by the few under bourgeois capitalism. At this point, we cannot help recalling Tocqueville's prediction of the consequences of concentrating all economic and political power in the hands of the central government and its bureaucrats. A totalitarian state in which all workers may be equal, but in which none is free. If the ideal is the classless society, or at least a society devoid of serious class conflicts, and one the members of which are not only equal but free, then, surprising as it may seem, it is the American educator Horace Mann, not Karl Marx, who gives us the formula for achieving the ideal. It is expressed in a single line in the little essay that is part of our reading on this occasion. Capital and labor in different classes are essentially antagonistic, but capital and labor in the same class are essentially fraternal. What that suggests is a republic in which all the citizens derive their income partly from the profits of capital and partly from the wages of labor, every man both a citizen and a capitalist, in an economy that preserves private property and free enterprise. The discussion has now reached the point where it is possible to distinguish 4 forms of capitalism, and then to ask which of these forms is most supportive of political democracy and individual freedom. The four forms can be named and briefly described as follows. 1. Bourgeois or 19th century capitalism, which now exists only in such backward countries as Saudi Arabia or Bolivia, and in which the ownership of capital is in the hands of the very few, with little or no participation by the many in economic welfare. 2. State capitalism, otherwise known as communism, in which the state owns all the means of production and distributes the wealth in such a way that all participate to some extent in the general economic welfare. 3. Socialized capitalism, or the mixed economy, as we know it in the United States, in England, in the Scandinavian countries, and so on, in which there is both a private sector and a public sector, some degree of private ownership and free enterprise, accompanied by elaborate government measure to ensure a welfare distribution. 4. Diffused or universal capitalism, the economy that is implicit in the formula proposed by Horace Mann, but does not yet exist, in which participation in the general economic welfare would be achieved by the ownership of capital rather than by welfare measures controlled and operated by the central government. The question to be answered is, if you had your choice, which of these four forms of capitalism would you prefer as the economic underpinning of political democracy? Which do you think would establish both political and economic equality without sacrificing either political liberty or individual freedom? Everything that we have learned in all the preceding days of our discussion now comes critically to bear on the choice of the answer. We have one more day and one more reading to help us decide, each man for himself in his own way, but obligated to give reasons for his choice. Second Saturday, 12th session. John Strachey, The Challenge of Democracy. I wish there were time to indicate how this final reading helps us to tie together all the threads of our preceding discussions, but not in such a way that the issues with which we have been wrestling are resolved, and we are left with certain conclusions on which we all agree. Instead, I must content myself with making the following few brief points. John Strachey, who, at one time, was a leading member of the British Communist Party and a renowned exponent of Marxist doctrine, reverses himself in this posthumously published essay, in which he argues that political democracy and the mixed economy come much nearer than communism to achieving the ideal that communism claims for itself, a relatively classless society with freedom and equality for all, together with a large measure of economic welfare for all. Strachey's very persuasive arguments do not prevent the discussion on this final day from reconsidering such questions as whether the mixed economy can solve the problem of its built-in inflationary spiral, whether its goal of full employment is not a misleading objective, and whether, by its very nature, the mixed economy is an unstable mixture that must resolve itself either by enlarging the public sector at the expense of the private, or move in the reverse direction, away from greater and greater concentration of power in the central government. Strachey, we observe, remains a Marxist at heart, even though he appears to favor the socialized capitalism of a representative democracy rather than the totalitarianism of state capitalism, or communism. We note particularly the passage in which he says, "In one way or another, the people of the advanced democratic societies will arrange the distribution of the national income to suit themselves. Experience shows that they can do this in a number of ways. The most obvious of these ways is so to arrange the tax structure that the main fruits of production do not go to the owners, but are shared, directly or indirectly, with the mass of the population." We cannot help observing how clearly this echoes a famous passage at the close of the Communist Manifesto. The first step in the revolution by the working class is to raise the proletariat to the position of the ruling class, to establish democracy. That is what the levelers were calling for when, in 1647, they demanded an extension of the franchise to those who owned no property. But, we then observe, Marx goes on to say, the proletariat will use its political supremacy to wrest by degrees all capital from the bourgeoisie, to centralize all instruments of production in the hands of the state, and to increase the total of productive forces as rapidly as possible. Of course, in the beginning this cannot be effected except by means of despotic inroads on the rights of property and on the conditions of bourgeois production, by means of measures, therefore, which appear economically insufficient and untenable, but which, in the course of the movement, outstrip themselves, necessitate further inroads upon the old social order, and are unavoidable as a means of entirely revolutionizing the mode of production. The measures, which Marx then enumerates, involve such things as a heavy progressive or graduated income tax, abolition of all right of inheritance, state ownership of the means of production, the very things that Cromwell and Ireton, back in 1647, feared would happen if the franchise were extended to include the many who are poor and without property. We have come full cycle, but with a reversed twist. In the 300 years since the debate in Cromwell's army, the many are now well off and politically powerful, and the few are no longer at the top, but at the bottom. This raises questions on which the Aspen readings may throw light, but which they cannot answer. Appendix 3. Seminars for Young People, an essential ingredient in basic schooling. Excerpts from an article published in the American School Board Journal, January 1982. 1. What are the essential ingredients for setting up seminars for young people involving great books and great ideas and aiming at intellectual discipline and philosophical thought? Let me first enumerate the external conditions that must be present. And after that, I will describe briefly what the teacher, or moderator of the seminar, a better name for it, must do. 1. The group should consist of no more than 20 or 25 students, ages anywhere from 12 to 18, all of whom are able to read above the 6th grade level. 2. The seminar must run for at least 2 hours. It cannot be conducted in the usual 50-minute class session. 3. The participants must be seated around a hollow square table, large enough to accommodate all of them comfortably, and in a way that enables them to see one another as well as the moderator, and to talk around the table and across it. Such seminars cannot be conducted in ordinary classrooms with a teacher standing in the front of the room and the students sitting in rows in front of the instructor. 4. The so-called teacher or instructor should not regard himself as a teacher or instructor in the usual sense of those words. To do so is to fail miserably. For such a seminar to be successful, it must be carried on as a discussion among equals, with the leader or moderator of the discussion superior only in the following respects: a little older, a little better reader, having done more reading, and with a better disciplined mind. These points of superiority should never become too manifest, or the seminar will degenerate from a discussion among equals, which it should be, into a didactic session in which teacher tells students what he knows or understands and acts as if they were there to imbibe his views without questioning them. The discussion leader or moderator must imitate Socrates, especially the calculated irony with which Socrates pretends not to know the right answers to the questions that are the backbone of the ongoing inquiry, in which Socrates himself is simply the principal inquirer, first among equals. 5. Finally, what is needed for such seminars are reading materials that satisfy the following conditions. A. They should be, unlike textbooks, over the heads of the students, so that they have to struggle and stretch to understand them. B. They should be relatively short in length, seldom more than 50 pages for a given occasion, and usually less than 30, so that they can be read through a number of times very carefully, marked and annotated. C. While short in length, they must be very rich in content, so that the topics they discuss and the issues they raise will support 2 hours of discussion. D. They must, therefore, be essentially philosophical texts, not merely factual or informational. That is, they must deal with ideas and raise questions that cannot ever be answered by empirical or experimental investigation, by historical research, or by going to an encyclopedia to look up the facts or get the information. In other words, the reading and discussion should aim at improved understanding, not increased knowledge. If all 5 of these external requirements cannot be fully satisfied, there is no point in undertaking such seminars. If the administration of a school is so inflexible that it cannot break through its rigid routine of 50-minute class sessions conducted in ordinary classrooms, that school is no place for such seminars. If instructors cannot be found who are willing to give up being teachers in the ordinary sense, teachers who teach by telling instead of by asking, or if instructors cannot be found who are willing to try to imitate Socrates, then such seminars should not be attempted. I greatly fear that there are many schools, too many, that cannot or will not meet all the conditions I have laid down. But there are no schools at all anywhere in our country in which some of the conditions do not already exist or cannot be fulfilled. In any school system there are always enough students who can participate profitably in such seminars, and the reading materials required are always available. 2. I come now to the heart of the matter. If all the external conditions I have mentioned are fully satisfied, what remains to be specified is the role of the moderator of such seminars. What should he or she do, and how should he or she do it? 1. First, and most important of all, the moderator must prepare for the conduct of such seminars by reading the work assigned as carefully as possible, with pencil in hand, all the crucial words whose precise meaning must be kept in mind, marking the pivotal sentences, or paragraphs in which the author states his underlying theses succinctly, argues for them, or raises questions about them, and making marginal notes of all sorts about the connections between one part of the text and another. 2. Next, the moderator must make a series of random notes about all the important points, questions, issues that occur to him as materials for discussion. 3. Then, carefully examining these random notes, the moderator should put down a very small number of questions, phrased with the greatest of care, that are to be the backbone of a 2-hour discussion. Sometimes just one question will suffice for the whole 2 hours. Sometimes 3 or 4 are needed, seldom if ever more than 5. If more than one, the questions must then be ordered so that the first opens up matter to be further explored by the second leads to further explorations by the third question, and so on. In addition, the questions must be such that everyone in the group can be called upon to answer them, and the best opening question is one that everyone around the table is required to answer in succession. 4. The moderator must never be satisfied with the answers given. The moderator must always ask why. No answer must be allowed to go by without having reasons offered in its support. 5. The moderator should never allow any student, even one who appears to be thinking and trying to answer the question, to get away with slovenly speech that is no more than a gurgle of words flung at the question with the hope that some of them may hit the target. The moderator should relentlessly demand that the student's answer to a question posed should be phrased so that it aims at the bullseye, that the student's statement is grammatically correct in every detail, and that the student speak in clearly defined sentences and even in well-formulated paragraphs. Above all, the moderator should never allow a single critical word to be used ambiguously or loosely. No one can legislate about how words should be used, but if 2 students use a given word in different senses, or if a student uses a word used by the author or by the moderator in a different sense, that difference in senses should be plainly recognized and labeled before the discussion proceeds another inch. 6. The moderator should insist upon relevance in the answering of the questions asked. By this, I mean no more than that the student attempt to answer the question, and not simply respond to it by blurting out whatever happens to be on his or her mind at the time. A question addressed to a student is not like the ringing of a bell, which indicates to the student that it is now his or her turn to speak, and invites him or her to say anything he or she wishes, whether it is an answer to the question or not. 7. If it appears from the way the question is being answered that the students do not really understand the question, the moderator must repeat the question in as many different ways as possible in an effort to be sure that the question is uniformly understood by all. There is no point in going on unless that is accomplished. The moderator may have to use a wide variety of concrete examples to get the question clear. Asking the same question in a variety of ways and accompanying it by a diversity of illustrations requires great intellectual energy upon the part of the moderator. Conducting seminars is far from being an easy or passive performance in which the moderator acts merely as chairman of a meeting at which the participants are invited to say anything they have on their minds. 8. As the discussion gets going, conflicting answers to a given question will begin to emerge, and then the moderator must make everyone explicitly aware of the issue that is being joined. Unless it is clearly formulated and fully understood, debate of the issue cannot be carried on. To aid such formulation and debate, the moderator should use the blackboard, putting on it some form of schematic diagram that frames the issue and indicates the opposing positions on it, so that the students can identify the position they are taking or the view they are defending. With repeated experiences of seminars about the same bit of reading, the moderator will learn in advance how to construct such diagrams and can often put them on the blackboard before the discussion begins. When thus presented in a schematic form, the diagrams will employ symbols that will at first appear to be mere hieroglyphics to the student, and will only become intelligible after the discussion has reached a certain point. 9. The seminar should not attempt to reach conclusions about which everyone agrees. On the contrary, it should leave the students with an understanding of questions to be answered and problems to be solved. The understanding of the questions and of the range of answers they elicit are the important things, not this or that answer, however true or profound. 10. In a succession of seminars, whatever understanding has been achieved in an earlier seminar should be used in dealing with questions or issues raised in later seminars. Therefore, a useful ordering of the reading materials is just as important as the proper selection of them in the first place. 11. The moderator must never talk down to the students, or treat them as most teachers do when they are sitting in front of them in 50-minute class sessions. The moderator must make the greatest effort to understand what is going on in the mind of another human being who, even though much younger, is struggling to understand something that is difficult for anyone, including the moderator, to understand. 12. The moderator must be patient and polite in dealing with everyone around the table, as patient and polite as one should be with guests at one's dinner table. The moderator should try to set an example of intellectual etiquette that the participants are induced to imitate. Above all, the moderator should conduct the whole discussion with a smile and try to produce laughter at as many points as possible. Nothing is more productive of learning than wit and laughter. 3. Here is a list of reading materials arranged in roughly chronological order, from which different selections can be made and set in different orders or sequences, depending on the number of sessions to be conducted in succession. Plato, The Apology, The Republic, Books 1 and 2. Aristotle, Ethics, Book 1. Politics, Book 1, together with Rousseau, The Social Contract, Book 1. Marcus Aurelius, Meditations, together with Epictetus and Enchiridion. Lucretius, On the Nature of Things, Books 1 through 4. Plutarch's Lives, Alexander and Caesar. Augustine's Confession,